My last video in this series was about the conjunction, an aspect where two planets appear very close to each other in the sky. They can be 1 degree away, or 2, or 3, all the way up to 10 degrees in the 360-degree circle around the Earth. The next major aspect is called the sextile. This is a cliff. For the sextile, we jump to planets being 60 degrees away from each other. 60 is actually in the word sextile itself. Sex is the Latin word for 6, and sextilis is Latin for 1/6, or 1/6 of the circle, which is 60 degrees. The best way to show how a sextile appears from Earth is to compare it to the conjunction. If a conjunction of the Moon and Venus looks like this, a sextile of the Moon and Venus looks like this. If a conjunction of Mars and Venus looks like this, a sextile looks like this. Most planets can be in sextile to each other. There are only 2 planets that can't, and both can't be in sextile to the Sun. Mercury never strays more than 25 degrees away from the Sun, so he cannot make a sextile. And Venus never strays more than 48 degrees away, so she cannot make a sextile to the Sun either. However, all of the outer planets can be in sextile to the inner planets or each other. For instance, throughout most of the 1940s, Uranus and Pluto were in sextile. Uranus was in Gemini, and Pluto was in Leo. If that sextile could have been seen with the naked eye, it would have looked like this. In terms of the chart and its symbolism, a conjunction puts the planets right next to each other, but in sextile, there's a sign between them. A Moon-Venus sextile is represented this way, and a Pluto-Jupiter sextile is represented this way in the horoscope. Now that we know how a sextile appears, it's time to talk about its meaning. Unlike a conjunction, where planets are fused and never operate independently from each other, planets in sextile keep their own identities. A sextile is lucky and opportunity-rich. You might be wondering why a 60-degree aspect would have this particular character. Well, the reason can be found in the natural wheel. A sextile links signs of the same gender. Look, the first masculine sign in the natural wheel is Aries. Go 60 degrees and you find another masculine sign, Gemini. In the same gender, signs are considered basically similar. Yet each one possesses traits that the other doesn't. And since signs in sextile have open access to each other's resources, they engage in frictionless sharing. For instance, Masculine fire says, let's blaze a trail. Masculine air says, okay, I have some ideas and I'll learn something from the quest. Fire brings the energy and air brings the rational mind. So this sextile has all it needs for some intellectual trailblazing. Let's round this out with another example, returning to the natural wheel. The first feminine sign is Taurus. Go 60 degrees and you find another feminine sign, Cancer. In the same gender, they're considered fundamentally compatible. Both are introverted and responsive, but they also have differences that the other can use. Feminine Earth says, I want to build something real. Feminine Water desires emotional connection. And so this sextile has all it needs to build a project that is infused with emotional meaning. Because there's a smooth, easy, helpful tone to the sextile in the natural wheel, all sextiles are stamped with that same character. Planets at either end of the sextile stand for two distinct facets of the native psyche that are always ready to cooperate. So, regardless of which planets are involved, the 60-degree angle indicates never-ending friendship. Now that you know some of the background and how the sextile got its character, the time has come for some interpretations. I'll use the same teaching method you saw in the conjunction video. I'll take one word from each planetary keyword list, pair them, and play with what the meaning of that pair could be. I'll use scenarios and examples to show how that word pairing and the planets they correspond to might manifest in an average birth chart. A good place to start our exploration is with the keyword lists for pleasure-loving Venus and disciplined old Saturn. Some of the keywords for Venus are appreciation, aesthetics, beauty, affection, closeness, connection, taste, sensuality, attraction, impressions, sexuality, art or the arts, enjoyment, value, love, pleasure seeking. Some of the keywords for Saturn are control, pragmatism, maturity, moderation, limits, wisdom, function, work, structure, authority, purpose, mentoring, instruction, slow, form, and responsibility. How about we investigate the word pleasure seeking from Venus's list and control from Saturn's list? Venus is unabashed, following her desires, sensuality, and sexuality without any thought of the consequences. That's her nature. Saturn's nature, on the other hand, is to consider the future and to exert control over behaviors that might cross the line. In Sextile, the relationship between control and pleasure seeking will be friendly. One of the possibilities here is that Saturn slows the pace of enjoyment. Now, this can have productive results. Slowing the pace of eating often results in reduction. Slowing the pace of lovemaking often results in sex that feels sacred. Slowing it even further can result in ecstatic sex. Once sex includes all of Venus's favorites: love, affection, deep attraction, sensuality, and closeness, the native gets more selective about partners. So in the end, both planets in sextile are happy. Venus receives greater pleasure, and Saturn gets to put moderation on that pleasure in a relaxed, non-triggering way. Let's pair the words appreciation and authority. One thing we might expect from this combination is connoisseur, which is a person who gains some authority as an appreciator of a particular pleasure. As a connoisseur, they're likely to connect with others, sharing their impressions, and even acting as a guide on a blog or a YouTube channel. We could also interpret this pairing as a native who is an authority in the art of appreciation itself, someone who can instruct others in cultivating taste or going through life in an artful way. Let's stick with the word appreciation and add maturity. How would you expect appreciation and maturity to combine in an easy way? This sextile might manifest as an individual who vibes with friends 20 years older than they are. Or with Venus at play, they might be attracted to older romantic partners. A Venus-Saturn sextile has a taste for wisdom, so they're likely to access the reservoir of insight found in their older friends whenever trouble starts brewing. And you would also not be surprised if this person went to the writings of the wise men and poets and philosophers of the ages. On a bodily level, this native might look forward to growing older, welcoming gray hairs and laugh lines, and especially appreciating the new social gravitas that comes with time. How about exploring the words love and limits? The most obvious interpretation is being able to dish out tough love or love with limits when need be. But it could also be the person who understands the limits of human love. If this sextile isn't born with the idea, they learn early that love does not conquer all, and that love cannot cure another person's psychological problems. In a variety of ways throughout life, this native will be shown the limits of their ability to love. But because sextiles are rich in luck and opportunity, learning their limits is likely to come as a simple lesson rather than a painful one. Let's take a look at the words beauty and responsibility. One interpretation of this word pairing is the native who finds responsibility beautiful. Of course, a lucky Venus-Saturn sextile will draw in perfectly suited responsibilities, which are more likely to work out. Maybe we have a native who has become a dad and he loves it. If you ask him, he's the most fortunate man in the world because he gets to love his kid every day. When he looks into his child's eyes, he feels healed, and he can't imagine how drab life would be without fatherhood. Where difficulties might arise in parenthood for others, this sextile brings open doors. Perhaps he finds it easy to finance the child, or maybe he has a partner who is lovingly focused on the kid as well. Sextiles bring fortune in multiple ways. Those ways are determined by the assets and liabilities in the rest of the chart, but they all coalesce to create a pleasant situation. Another interpretation of this word pairing could be the native who thinks it's her responsibility to stay beautiful no matter how many years go by. She likes looking good because when you look good, you feel good. Yes, standards of attractiveness as well as her style of dress change as she ages, but her appearance has always been an art in her eyes. But let's say we have a more introverted chart where life happens inside. A woman with this sextile might make inner beauty her main responsibility. She finds herself in workshops and really helpful silent retreats in the mountains. She likes to sit on the deck at night because the time alone brings her to a deeper level of herself. And over time, she's noticed that all her relationships keep getting closer. The idea of cultivating inner beauty never goes away. And this sextile brings plenty of openings so she can fulfill that responsibility to herself. What can we say about the aesthetics of Venus combined with the functionality of Saturn? Aesthetics and functionality is another way to say beauty that's useful. And if we're going to talk about this particular word pairing, we should look at architecture because it's a great place to see aesthetics and functionality coming together. Frank Lloyd Wright is the architect who designed Falling Water. This is a structure that spans a waterfall on Bear Run River in Pennsylvania. The most aesthetically dynamic thing about this design is how the straight, saturnine lines of the man-made structure contrast the organic Venusian lines of nature. But this structure also has a function. It's a family home. Another place that comes to mind when I see the words aesthetics and functionality is a building in New Delhi, India, that's made to look like an enormous lotus flower. It has a base and then petals that reach up into the sky. From an aerial perspective, you can see pools around the petals, suggesting that the lotus is alive, floating in a pond. And at night, it emits a soft glow. Gorgeous, yes. Aesthetic perfection, yes. but it also has a purpose. It's a functioning Baha'i house of worship where people from all the world's religions are welcome to use the serene space to connect to their own faith, whatever that may be. Of course, there are far smaller examples of beauty and usefulness converging. The surrealist painter Salvador Dali went out of his lane and made some furniture, such as this dresser, this chair, this sexy couch. Here's another piece with purpose, an unforgettable bench by Pablo Reynoso. But you can even go smaller with a favorite of ceramicists, teapots, cups. There are endless ways to create, and the greatest gift of the Venus-Saturn sextile, in my view, is the ability to put beauty into useful, tangible form. Let's examine another planetary pair, Mercury's sextile Neptune. Keywords for Mercury are self-expression, understanding, perception, language, speaking or writing, communication, details or accuracy, mind, versatility, mental, messaging, learning, student, consciousness, social, intellect, and observation. The keywords for Neptune are big picture, intuition, imagination, soul, haunting or ghosts, sensitivity, universal, transcendence, creativity, mystical, flow, spiritual, subtleties, oceanic or nebulous, otherworldly, and poetry or the arts. Just eyeballing these lists, you can see that Mercury is mental and detail-oriented. Neptune is spiritual and has universal ideas. Mercury stands for the intellect, and Neptune stands for the soul. These planets are actually quite different from each other by nature, but that matters not at all when it comes to a sextile. Planets and sextiles support each other, not just sometimes, but always. The 60-degree aspect works without resistance and without defense. So the arrangement brings lots of strengths and opportunities. When the native with a Mercury-Neptune sextile speaks, you can hear the flow of their mind, the stream of consciousness. This flow makes data-driven Mercury more interesting on the whole, and we usually get good storytelling abilities. We know that Mercury, the gabby god with winged feet, always has a message that it wants to get across. But alone, it isn't artistic. When found in easy aspect to Neptune, that changes. If you ask Neptune, there's an art to living and dying and working and breathing
and relating and loving. There's even an art to war. When it comes to this aspect, Neptune contributes the art, and socially inclined Mercury brings that art to other people. Now, let's return to our keyword lists, but this time we'll make pairs and play with some interpretations. How about exploring the word mind from Mercury's list and sensitivity from Neptune's list? If we bring these two together, we get sensitivity of mind. What exactly does that kind of sensitivity mean? It means the individual is aware of subtle things in the environment, items that others may miss. A line, a splash of color, a movement, a word choice, a change in behavior, a micro expression. Neptune's influence makes the normally arid planet of perception more supple and responsive. Though the traits may be similar, sensitivity of mind will express itself differently depending on the context. It might be applied one way by a surgeon, another way by a homicide detective interrogating a suspect, and yet another way by a man who is seducing his partner. So let's look at a real life example. Let's see how the Mercury-Neptune sextile manifested itself in the life of a legendary writer, the Bard of Avon, Mr. William Shakespeare. I always loved Shakespeare's plays, but I had never looked at his birth chart. Today, I was doing what a lot of us do. I was cleaning and listening to YouTube on autoplay. Some time had passed, so I can't say where that string of videos began, but I know where it ended. A man who was in his early 20s was sitting outside in a garden. He was making observations about an individual who is always in the news. The young man said of this person, "Methinks he doth protest too much." The actual line from Hamlet, spoken by Gertrude, is, "The lady doth protest too much, methinks." But either way, it suddenly struck me as quite amazing that 425 years later, the line had managed to survive at all. An idea from England's golden age made it to a video sharing platform in the digital age. It arrived relatively intact and with its meaning totally intact. And it's in such common parlance that a regular Joe on YouTube is saying it and the audience understands. With my curiosity thoroughly piqued, I sat down at my desktop and opened a new tab. There I searched Shakespeare's natal chart. When the wheel appeared, I found a Mercury-Neptune sextile, the very planetary aspect I had chosen for this section. But that wasn't surprising. If you don't already know this, you'll find out as you continue to study. Astrology is famous for serendipities. As you take in this image, a question might just arise. Can you put Neptune in an old chart? Is it kosher to put Neptune into a chart of a person who was born hundreds of years before Neptune was even discovered? Yes, outer planets can be placed in old charts, though you might want to do it on a case-by-case basis. Shakespeare is a definite yes because he lived in England at the peak of the Renaissance, a time of cultural rebirth where the cynical, pessimistic view of people that had existed through the Middle Ages was exchanged for a humanistic philosophy. People started to be seen as okay, unique, emotional, and complex. This attitude about us underpins all of modern culture and modern astrology. So I think it's quite appropriate to use Neptune in Shakespeare's chart. Let's go back to the first word pairing from earlier, sensitivity and mind, and break that down. Shakespeare was sensitive to mind, to language, to messaging, to communication, and to writing. He even lived at a sensitive time when English was changing quickly. Elizabethan English was becoming modern English. Word order was changing. Pronouns were being dropped. Words were being soaked up from other languages. English was being standardized. And Shakespeare jumped into it all with both leotard-wrapped feet. Now let's keep language from Mercury's list and also circle creativity from Neptune's list. How exactly was Shakespeare creative with language? Language gave his characters another dimension, a dimension that characters in plays had lacked for the past 1,000 years, a Renaissance dimension, a humanist dimension. He also created new words. Sometimes he just made them up. Sometimes he combined existing words. He changed nouns into verbs and verbs into nouns and added beginnings and endings. Shakespeare is thought to have given more than 2,000 words to English. He came up with assassin, gloomy, premeditated, misplaced, and even one that sounds quite modern, unfriended. Neptune is a water planet. It picks up on minor movements. Mercury is the god of social intercourse. Put those two together, and what does it tell you about this sextile? One of its skills is the ability to notice little things and make astute observations. In other words, sensitivity of mind includes sensitivity in social perceptions. Shakespeare had his finger on the pulse. He knew people. He knew how to write them, and he knew how to write for them, hence his popularity. But in any native's chart, this sextile makes the person likable. That's because Mercury is already flexible when it comes to communication. Add Neptune's flow, and this sextile represents someone who can communicate in 1,000 different ways. By that, I mean this native can talk to almost anyone about almost anything. When you find this aspect in a natal chart, you can be assured interests lean toward Neptunian subjects like dreams, fantasy stories, magic, the sea, and the supernatural. And Neptunian matters come out of this sextile in Shakespeare's plays just as we would expect them to. Shakespeare's themes included fate and destiny, but also metaphysics like spells, witches, ghosts. There's a haunting in Hamlet as well as in Macbeth. In both cases, ghosts speak to let the audience know what's going on in the character's mind. This is a perfect interweaving of Mercury's words and Neptune's otherworldliness. And I would wager that in Shakespeare's personal life, this sextile probably expressed itself as a fondness for the words of dead people. He probably read a lot of quotes from influential people in history and took inspiration from their life stories, which is similar to being spoken to by a ghost. We know that in general, Neptune's nature is quite nebulous. We also know that Mercury is extremely fluent and accurate. When these two are in sextile, we get something positive. So we have to ask, what is the best result? Mercury articulates what is normally nebulous. Mercury finds a way to describe the indescribable. I think this is the greatest strength of the Mercury-Neptune sextile, and perhaps the rarest skill. This skill is the foundation of poetry, where words are used to transcend words and to evoke images. I found this sextile in the charts of poets so often that I call it the poet's mark. Shakespeare had this sextile, as you know, and though his plays built his reputation and paid the rent, he thought of himself first and foremost as a poet. Mercury-Neptune sextile is found in the birth charts of the poets Anne Sexton, Sylvia Plath, Adrienne Rich, Poet Laureate Rita Dove, Ogden Nash, Santiago Baca, Gertrude Stein, and Dante. Visual artists tend to have this sextile an awful lot too. It's in the charts of painters Claude Monet, John Constable, Edward Hopper, and Rembrandt. This list of painters can now be used to illustrate something else about a sextile, and that is the easy nature of the 60-degree aspect. What does easy actually mean, and how did it manifest in real life? In respect to their art, they all had a lot of luck. They all came from families that valued and could provide education. They were all encouraged in their efforts from the very beginning. I mean, as soon as the nascent stirrings of talent started to pop up. Another shared experience was that they were all taken under the wing of at least one important artist early on. Attracting a mentor is specific to the Mercury Neptune sextile. Mercury is the planet associated with being a student, and Neptune is the planet of fateful encounters. The last thing they had in common is that they regularly found themselves in advantageous situations that protected, cultivated, or expanded their work. Let me give you an example of how an easy sextile might manifest in the life of a young artist. I'll use Claude Monet as a for instance. As a kid, Claude was very much encouraged by his mother, who had a particular interest in his drawing. She even took him around so that he could do caricatures for the neighbors. Monet's family was wealthy too. They were able to buy him all the art supplies he needed for whatever method he wanted to try, and soon he took up painting. Then his family moved to the French coast. There he had the whole ocean to play with. Claude studied how light and color reflected off the water at various times during the day, and he became quite good in his unique style. At 15, he was befriended by a well-known artist who gave him an intense private education. Monet then found himself at the Art Academy, where he rounded things out with formal instruction, and where one of his classmates just so happened to be Renoir. He frequently went on exhibit and sold well from the start. He had just the right way of seeing things at just the right time to become the leader of Impressionism. Monet was never a starving artist. Now, don't get me wrong, he still had to focus and he had to make sound decisions. But sextiles tend to set you up well and reward you with more energy than you put in. That is what is meant by easy. Your job with a sextile is to just not blow it. Let's do one last keyword combination. We'll use intellect off Mercury's list and transcendence off Neptune's list. From this combination, we can surmise that the native will have an itch to transcend the intellect. Transcendence can occur through the creative process or through artistic performance. Not everyone has a creative spark, in which case they have to take another route. They might instead use long periods of meditation or prayer, or even tantric sexuality, where sexual energy, visualization, and breathing combine to cause a state in which the identity atomizes and the native becomes one with something oceanic. Another way to transcend intelligence is by way of psychedelic plants. One Mercury-Neptune sextile who spent his adult life pursuing this particular route was Terence McKenna. He was an ethnobotanist, a teacher, a lecturer, an author, and with Mercury rising in Sag, a true explorer. Terence McKenna dedicated 25 years to studying consciousness, examining transcendence, documenting his experiences and speaking in a way that was unusual, to be sure. Most of the time, when people use psychedelic compounds, they come back from their trip and characterize their experience as wild. Even after dozens of journeys, they're no better at giving description. They say it was crazy, insane. There are even people who have used psychedelics extensively. They say that nature's pharmacy was a huge part of their education, and they've benefited in every way. They say memorable, spiritually moving things, and they tell meaningful stories. But when it comes to the psychedelic trips themselves, they still lack the words. Terence McKenna was an unusual figure because he could describe transcendence and he could convey psychedelic states of consciousness. If he got wisdom from another entity in an alternate universe, he could somehow bring it back whole. He could make an illogical, manic state perfectly understandable. How did he do it? Just as Shakespeare made up words and phrases, McKenna made up the words and phrases he needed to get a novel idea across. The same way Shakespeare put together words or added prefixes and suffixes, so did McKenna. Centuries passed between these two men, but their shared aspect, the Mercury-Neptune sextile, did the same thing in almost exactly the same way, for the same reason, to describe the indescribable. I'm going to end this video with a question. Do sextiles have a dark side? I wouldn't call it dark, no, only a slightly less favorable side. And that's only coming from an action-oriented, competitive, Western mindset. But let's come from that mindset for a bit. Sextiles are known for a certain passivity. That's the nature of 60 degrees. It's normal for sextiles to spend a lot of time in a state of potential rather than a state of action. Sextiles are known to just sit there until they're activated by a transiting planet. Their highest rate of activity and luck and benefit occurs when a transit hits the dominant planet in the sextile. You can decide if you think that's even less favorable. Now, there is one situation in which a sextile can be negative over the long haul. That's when a chart has an overabundance or a serious overrepresentation of sextiles. Charts with a bundle formation, for instance, especially when the bundle is exceptionally tight and the planets don't even spread far enough to make a single square. Yet even in that situation, the native might not know that anything is going awry while it's happening. As Kierkegaard said, life is lived forward, but only understood backwards. A native has to reach an appreciable age before they can look back over the decades with an aerial view and see that perhaps there wasn't enough tension and restriction overall. Too many sextiles can make you see too many options. It can give you too many talents. There are too many things at which you're good enough to give it a go. If you see too many open doors and too many paths stretching out in front of you, it can lead to a strange form of paralysis. And this is especially problematic if you're born into a typical Western life where you'll peruse your options and decide what you want on just about every front. You'll have to decide where you want to live and what you want to be, who you want to love, what occupation is best, if you want marriage, if you want children, and those are just the major themes, to say nothing of all the details. And of course, each question needs to be reassessed at each phase of what now tends to be quite a long life. So, in short, the sextile itself doesn't have a dark side. An excess of sextiles can indeed have a dark side, but anything in excess can. Thank you for watching Secrets from an Astrologer's Desk. Stay tuned for all the ways you can get in touch for a birth chart reading and full astrological services. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm Joy. Next in the Major Aspect series is the square.